Thank you, Peter, and thank you, everybody, for taking the time to come on Monday afternoon to hear what we have to say. So this, I didn't think of it as a tag team. I thought maybe it's an attempted kind of, hopefully not comic double act, but the double act of some description. And really, a large part of it is kind of some ideas that we've been developing recently and trying to bring together different case studies. So we really will welcome any comments, suggestions, or questions that people may have at the end. Now, as Peter said, and as the title suggests, today we'll be discussing the general election to Westminster of October 1924. I'm going to begin by focusing largely on the election within the old West Belfast constituency. And then Graham's going to take us across the water, not to Parkhead or to Ibrox, but down the road a little bit to North Lanarkshire and the old Motherwell constituency. Okay? And really these election campaigns function for us as a kind of entry point for us to discuss some wider themes that interest us. Relate it in broad terms to the relationship and the dynamics at play between the politics of the north of Ireland, the young Northern Ireland state, and the politics of Scotland. And to be more precise, interwar Labour politics in Belfast and in the old industrial belt of Scotland. So we're going to try and use kind of a comparative framework, but also thinking about the relationship between the flow of personnel and ideas back and forth between the two as well. And a central question for our broader work really is, how did varieties of Labour politics attempt to either confront, negotiate or avoid the familiar sectarian divisions and political complexities associated with the Irish question? Now, that these issues dominated an election in Belfast is unsurprising, but it's perhaps underappreciated just how significant these issues were in a place like Motherwell in defining the political contours and fault lines at a time like this. And today's people are focused on one particular variety, a kind of foundational variety of Labour politics in Britain and Ireland, that of Christian socialism. So we mean by this Christian people who were Christian socialist candidates, but we also mean the campaign or even just Christian socialist discourse that was employed in these campaigns. We believe that considering the West Belfast and Motherwell campaigns together opens up fresh perspectives on the interplay between religion, denominational allegiance, social class, and the construction of national identities. So kind of new perspectives in some old familiar questions. Now, both West Belfast and Motherwell featured Christian socialists who attempted to use specifically Presbyterian historical identities and values in order to support a cross-community Labour platform. Now, and in both these constituencies, these Labour campaigns were in competition, in opposition to conservative unionist candidates who can be seen as representing a kind of different shades of kind of Presbyterian orangism. Okay? Now, we won't have much time today to really talk about the unionist candidates in great detail, but they are kind of fascinating figures in their own right. And although they can be seen as representing conceptions of the conservative unionist Presbyterian establishment in both places, they also represent kind of the internal frictions and factionalism of those blocs themselves. Indeed, most of the figures that we're going to be talking about from the Labour and unionist side can be seen as kind of campaigning in an uneasy dialogue with Protestant history and Protestant identity. Now, we acknowledge that when it comes to Northern Ireland, Christian socialists, or Labour more broadly, was often marginal to the political life. So why do we think they're worth considering? Well, first of all, there's a general point about the old Northern Ireland Labour Party's surprising electoral success at different stages in pre-Troubles Northern Ireland, and the disproportionate role that Christian socialists played within that old party. Secondly, even whenever Labour and Christian socialists were unsuccessful at the polls, which was the majority of the time, in their campaigns they revealed interesting fault lines, or an interesting perspective on the fault lines dividing the two old communities, but also within the old communities, and also in this case within specific congregations and churches. Now, to talk about Christian socialism, the old cliche, which I think can be attributed to Morgan Phillips, that British Labour owes more to Methodism than to Marx, that's a cliche because it has a degree of truth about it. And there were hugely significant Anglican and Catholic strands of social justice theory and practice within British Labour, but the nonconformist strand is the most pronounced when we think about the construction of the early culture and ethos of the young British Labour Party. Now, the occasionally moralising tone of the Labour of Keir Hardie, we think of issues such as temperance with regards to alcohol, moral self-improvement, working class respectability, these kind of issues. They're at the heart of the DNA of the Labour Party at this stage. Okay. We also think there's also an opportunity within this work to reconsider more broadly the interaction between Christian socialists in the British Labour Party and the religious divisions within the working class, not just in somewhere like this, but within Liverpool, Glasgow, or other places. Now, to briefly explain the extreme complexities of 1920s Belfast Labour in about 5 seconds, here we go. Now, in March 1924, we see the official foundation of the Northern Ireland Labour Party, and it is essentially an autonomous party. It has links, institutional, financial, personnel links with the British Labour movement and with an all-Ireland trade union movement, but essentially it is an autonomous party. Now, during the political and social turmoil in this city from about 1912 to 1923, various fragmented strands kept the idea of political representation of the union movement alive. One strand obviously was the Republican, James Connolly-inspired strand, and another was the old independent Labour Party tradition, which was within the British Labour Party and had been formed in Belfast in 1893 following the Trade Union Congress, the British Trade Union Congress, which was held here in that year. And actually, in both the case studies that we're discussing today, the ILP is really important institutionally and ideologically. It was a kind of a welcoming home for Christian socialists who associate it with its kind of self-proclaimed strand of ethical socialism. There's the old GDH Cole line that if the Fabians provided the brains for the early Labour Party, then the ILP provided the soul. And that's a little bit patronising, but maybe also a little bit true. And just at this stage, I also want to say a little bit about the connections between Belfast Labour and Scottish Labour. Beyond the usual family, migration, institutional, socio-economic ties, there also were institutional ties between, for example, the Belfast and Glasgow cooperative movement, and there were important Scottish figures within Belfast Labour at the time. One that Myrtle has written about, Margaret McCoubrey, and another, Hugh Gemmell, who's a very significant figure within what we have to talk about today and within the North Belfast ILP. It was, for example, perfectly natural that maybe the main social occasion for the Belfast Labour Party in this era was the annual Burns Night Supper. That was just seen as entirely natural. Now, to actually go on and talk about the election. The election in 1924 is called after the collapse of the first short-lived UK Labour government, led by Ramsay MacDonald. And it had come into power in the context of the really difficult international and domestic legacies of World War I, trying to prove Labour as a party of government whilst being dependent upon Liberal MPs for support in Parliament. And of course, part of the international context was the Red Scares trying to associate British Labour with the Bolsheviks, and that became a central part of this electoral campaign across the UK, including in Belfast and Motherwell. Now, let's move along here. The context of Northern Ireland, of course, is the instability of the new state. Fresh memories of the traumas of the Home Rule crisis, partition, all the issues that we're all familiar with. Now, to state the obvious, the future unionist one-party dominance and the paralysis of electoral politics in this place were an unknown future in 1924. The short-term survival of the state was very much still considered up for grabs. The Boundary Commission, which copper-fastened partition the following year, was yet to report. Obviously, we're still taking evidence during this election. So the standard unionist strategy of making the election about the border had an added potency and common sense about it in many ways in 1924. Now, when the Westminster election is called in October of that year, it quickly became clear that the only threat to the Unionists not sweeping the board in Northern Ireland and returning with all 13 MPs was West Belfast. And that was due in large part to the decision of the Nationalist Party to boycott the election. And we're into real complex territory here about the history of Northern nationalism and republicanism in this time. But they kind of went back and forth on the issue of abstentionism. Sometimes Sinn Féin abstaining, sometimes the Nationalist Party, sometimes both. And also specific to 1924, was Nationalist Party outrage at the ending of proportional representation for the local government elections and the clear gerrymander of Derry and other local government wards. So all these issues are at play at this time, okay? Now, the interest in the West Belfast result was due to the extraordinary campaign and result that had occurred in 1923. And hopefully this works, okay? So this is the result in 1923, and we can see a very competitive election on a high turnout. And you can see that the Northern Ireland Labour Party is yet to be born, so the guy Midgley is standing under the banner of Belfast Labour. So, you know, this campaign was really a warning shot around the bows of unionism, because Midgley was able to campaign in all areas of the constituency, right? This is the old West Belfast constituency of not only the Falls and the Shankill, but also the Sandy Row and the Donegal Road. And he received not always a welcome reception, but he was able to campaign in all these districts. And when the unionist candidate Robert Lynn campaigned on the Shankill, for example, he was shouted down, he was haggled, and a senior member of the Unionist Party, Thomas Donald, was heard to utter, "What has went wrong with the Shankill?" Okay, so this is the kind of dynamics that are at play within this election. Now, to state the obvious, West Belfast has a history of being an incredibly ill-tempered and dirty electoral area. We think not only of this election, but 1964, 1983, we can rhyme off the examples. The issue of, you know, vote early, vote often, bringing out the dead to vote, all these old cliches have a truth about them and kind of do add a little bit of complexity about analysing electoral results in a constituency such as this. It was also the heartland of Joe Devlin, the old Northern nationalist icon, who, the former MP for this area as well, who sat out these elections, and through his the kind of Devlinite newspaper, the Irish News, he advocated support for Midgley as the anti-unionist candidate as well. So we've got the situation of Midgley, despite having the support of the Nationalist Party, or large parts of the Nationalist Party machinery, and despite having the kind of vicious campaign against them, was able to attract a substantial number of essentially voters from unionist areas. Some suggestions would have that as half those voters have been from unionist areas. It's probably a little bit less than that, but it's a substantial amount. Now, as I say, 1924 was going to be a rerun of this election, with the caveat that in 1924 we also had an anti-treaty Sinn Féin candidate decided to throw his hat into the ring. He was never going to win the seat, but he adds a different level of complexity to the election. Now, just to go through the biography of the main two candidates here. Robert Lynn is the editor of the Northern Whig, the old kind of capital L, as the name suggests, liberal unionist newspaper with a strongly Presbyterian heritage, which by this time is one of the three daily newspapers in Belfast and is a definitively strong unionist newspaper. The other candidate is Harry Midgley, who, I should at this stage say, has a fantastic book written about him by Greer that you should all read, called The Politics of Frustration. And here, let me show you a little picture of Midgley. Midgley was born into a unionist family in the Seaview area of North Belfast. From the age of 14, he was active in the Independent Labour Party, and through his job in the shipyard, became active in the union movement. He fought throughout World War I and suffered quite a traumatic experiences in the war, authoring a volume of poetry after the war called Thoughts from Flanders. Post-war, he became secretary of one of the local linen unions and continued his involvement in the local Labour Party. His politics on the issue of the border are difficult to define. I think it's fair to say that around the war and early post-war years, he is more sympathetic to a kind of James Connolly analysis of Ireland. I'm looking across at Graham here, that he's going to disagree. But as we're going to find out, that changes quite quickly, and then develops an interest in ways as we get into the 1930s, 1940s. Let's see now. Now, I've talked a little bit about how Lynn campaigned against Midgley. Here's one example. This is from the Northern Whig, I think, the 1923 campaign, where, interestingly, unemployment is the issue. What are the Unionist Party going to do about unemployment? This is about how James Craig and Lynn are going to solve unemployment in Ulster. But I'm not sure if you can read it at the back there, but the nice little slogan they come up with is Midgley for Moscow, Lynn for Westminster. So we can see the kind of subtlety, the subtlety at play within this campaign. So the Northern Whig also said, for example, that Midgley, although there were some good Christian folk within the Labour Party, that the brand of politics that he was promoting in the end produced, quote, aggressively anti-Christian governments. So what was Midgley's actual platform? First of all, to start, that is based upon the British Labour Party platform. He tried to disassociate that from the issues of the border, but it's clear that he's standing, quote, on the programme and policy expounded by Ramsay MacDonald. His specific manifesto commitments were the introduction of a national minimum wage, a universal 8-hour working week, pensions for widowed mothers and for ex-servicemen, and reducing the pension age to 60. With regards to the border question, Midgley walked a tightrope familiar to Labour activists in Northern Ireland. His campaign declared him, quote, neither a Labour nationalist or a Labour unionist, but when canvassing in different districts, Midgley's campaign undoubtedly sent out conflicting smoke signals. On the Falls, for example, he told a rally of his commitment to campaign for the release of Republican internees, while on the Schenkel, when asked if he supported the border, he filibustered, and when asked if he supported a republic, he responded, quote, only if it's a republic based on the American Republic, which might have been a good answer to a crowd of Belfast Protestants in about 1780, but 1920, a little bit more complex. When challenged on the border, Midgley often highlighted his Protestantism. So what was his relationship with Christianity? It appears his faith had been dented by the experiences of the war, but in his speeches and pamphlets, Labour values are filtered through the language of the good book. Poverty and injustice are described as social sins. He critiqued, quote, the so-called pillars of the church, who supported the economic status quo. They profess to believe in the Trinity, but deep in their hearts, the only Trinity they serve is rent, interest, and profit. In a later speech, he promoted what he defined as sex equality and 4 months paternity pay as, quote, a good Christian act. He drifted across numerous Protestant churches later in his life, but from the war through to the mid-20s, he was a member of Agnew Street Presbyterian Church on the Schenkel. Importantly, he was also a regular attender at evening services held at the York Street non-subscribing Presbyterian Church, and this church was to become at the heart of the 1924 campaign. Now, it got to the heart of the 1924 campaign in part because of the contribution of this guy. W.F. Marshall, a Presbyterian minister from Tyrone, is also a poet, kind of popular poet. Interestingly, a popular poet on a kind of cross-community basis in many ways. He's also an historian of the Scotch Irish in America. And, you know, he's a fascinating figure, but just to kind of encapsulate what this guy's about, he presented a vision of Ulster Presbyterianism best encapsulated by the fact that he was an Orangeman who frequently gave sermons at Orange services where he justified the 1798 rebellion and was dismissive of, quote, Englishmen with Oxford accents telling Irish folk what to do. So if you can untangle the complexities of that, you can move forward. But in the context of the 1924 election, he was invited by Robert Lynn to campaign on the Schenkel to proclaim the importance of unionist unity. Referencing his background in the old UVF, Marshall was reported as saying that, quote, in Tyrone, Republicans had been tamed and whipped, and when they went to bed, some of them had went under the bed. The implication being that the Schenkel should maybe follow suit. In response, the nationalist press, unsurprisingly, branded Marshall the mad Orangeman of Tyrone, and he became kind of the symbol of this vicious election. And it was vicious even by the standards of West Belfast. Midgley was attacked on the Schenkel, his election agent was assaulted, He was chased from the Sandy Row and Donegal Road, and his street campaign was restricted largely to the Falls. However, the set piece event, and it's kind of the focus for this Christian socialist element of this discussion, the set piece election campaign event took place at the Ulster Hall, and when alongside Midgley, 3 Protestant clergymen spoke. And they were essentially clearly there to kind of counter the narrative put forward by Lynn and Marshall and the other surrogates to the Unionist campaign. The first clergyman who spoke was the Reverend J. Bruce Wallace, who's a kind of eccentric and fascinating figure who manages to link Lenin, Trotsky and Limavady in an interesting way. So if anybody wants to ask me about that, they can go for it. The second preacher was the Reverend Fripp, who was an old non-subscriber Presbyterian. And the third speaker was this guy, the Reverend Arthur Lyndon Agnew. That's a picture from his papers from about this kind of mid-1920s period. Now, from 1923 to 1941, Agnew was the minister in the non-subscribing church at York Street. And this was the church Harry Midgley attended evening services in this church. He had been born in Moira. As a young man, Agnew had signed the Ulster Covenant. And then in 1916, he had served in World War I in the pioneering years of the Royal Flying Corps, kind of precursors to the RAF. Taking over the ministry at York Street, Agnew turned a dying congregation into a unique, successful church. Unusually for the theologically liberal non-subscribers here in Belfast, it was a largely working-class church. In fact, it became known as the Labour Congregation and was the centre for welfare provision, cross-community theatre and music. For example, the young Thomas Carn Duff, I think, performed for some of his first plays at York Street Church, as well as being a platform for Agnew's socially and politically infused version of the gospel. Recalling those early years in the church in a letter to an American colleague, Agnew noted that there was great poverty and distress. The church here in York Street was open every day and every night for people who had nowhere else to go. When others criticised his congregation in terms laced with snobbery and class resentment, Agnew responded by calling York Street, quote, the class that belongs to the kingdom of heaven. In the 1920s and 1930s, Agnew was a prominent supporter of the Northern Ireland Labour Party. This is exhibited here in an edition of the Labour Opposition, which is essentially the ILP newspaper. And this is from 1925, where he's outlining the connection between his Christianity and his socialism. His sermons constructed an historical narrative that attempted to attach and unite conceptions of the Reformation, Ulster Scots culture. For example, they called Rabbi Burns a prophet, democratic church government, egalitarianism, all these issues with the cause of 20th century Labour. So, to go back to the election in 1924, when Agnew takes to the platform in the Ulster Hall, he begins with a pointed comparison between the war records of Midgley and himself compared to Robert Lynn's lack of war service. His main theme, however, was that Christianity and Labour could coincide. And obviously Marshall's speech is kind of the unnamed subtext to this contribution. Agnew noted that proceedings at Lynn's rallies did not strike him, quote, as very Christian in character. He argued that Labour, Christianity and religious freedom were natural allies, and he talked of the secondary importance of the border compared with the social conditions of West Belfast. As to the B specials, and this is a part of the speech that made Agnew kind of notorious in the Belfast press, he said the B stood for bricks, bottles, booze, and the boundary, meaning the border. And notice the inclusion of booze in there. But Agnew's claim on the moral high ground was somewhat sullied by a kind of broad brush attack on Lynn's supporters as a whole. He said, quote, 10,000 yahoos who run about West Belfast cursing the Pope, and yet they had not been in a church since the Boer War. And the fallout from the speech, Agnew came under sustained attack from the Unionist press. The Belfast Telegraph used alliteration back at Agnew. They wrote A stands for asinine, archaic, Ananias and Agnew. and I think Ananias was condemned to death as a liar in the New Testament, Max?
He embezzled the church fund, and he and his wife had the hence murder. Right,
there we go. So, anyway, I realise I'm conscious of time here, so go on to the actual. This is the result of this kind of bitter campaign, and you can see an increase that Midgley kind of held his own, broadly speaking, but an increased turnout. The Unionist vote went up, and the anti-Treaty Sinn Féin candidate had got a small vote, but kind of an important vote in the way that the balance had been spread out. And we can ask questions about how the election had been conducted in terms of those figures. I just want to say, as a quick kind of, Graham addressed some of these themes in the conclusion, but just as a kind of quick kind of coda or follow-up to what we've been talking about here. In the following year, 1925, there were local government elections held in West Belfast where nationalists stood against Labour candidates. And when they did so, they attacked them as anti-Catholic Bolsheviks. The nationalist candidate, in one constituency in the Falls, said that the battle was straightforwardly between Catholicism and Bolshevism. The other kind of longer term irony with Midgley, of course, which some of you know in Graham's book details, is that if we fast forward to the 1930s, Midgley had become a kind of the Stormont MP for the Docks area with a predominantly Catholic voting base, and he took a position in support of the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War, which immediately caused him to be at the centre of a storm where the Irish News campaigned against him as an anti-Catholic Labour candidate, and he subsequently lost his seat in the Docks and became quite embittered by that. Then formed the Commonwealth Labour Party, left the Labour Party, formed the Commonwealth Labour Party, which in large part was inspired by Christian socialist ideas of the British Commonwealth Party, in particular John McMurray. And then the other side of World War II, he ends up joining the Unionist Party in 1947 and being quite we go for staunch Unionist as the Education Minister there forward. So we can see these kind of interactions between religious identity and the border and all these issues. And I hand over to Graham, who's going to take on the next component.
Thanks very much, James. Midgley, also chairman of Linfield Football Club. I think it's very important to stress that, even when he was a Labour leader in the 1930s. Before I get to the election contest in Motherwell in 1924, which is my main focus, I want quickly to provide some necessary context. First, these were turbulent political times, and Motherwell was a particularly volatile constituency. Maybe, James, if you show the results. I think we can appreciate this from the fact that successive election contests were won by, firstly, a communist, secondly, an Orangeman, that's the next one, Hugh Ferguson, and finally a dissenting Presbyterian socialist, the Reverend James Barr, who is going to be one of the main focuses of the paper. The Glasgow Herald, during the 1924 campaign, indeed commented on what it called the bewildering cross-currents of local opinion. Now, industrial Lanarkshire, in which Motherwell was, of course, situated, was a place in which class loyalties jostled those of religion or ethnicity. There was a strong leftist colouring to the constituency and a long history of fractious industrial relations. However, the area also reflected the impact of significant Irish immigration, which dated back to the middle of the 19th century. And this was both Catholic and Protestant, both green and orange. The orange vote, as it was called, in the constituency was estimated by the Glasgow Herald in 1924 to be around 4,000. The impact of recent seismic developments both in Russia and in Ireland had made their mark by this time on the constituency. Moreover, Scotland generally was reeling from the losses which she had incurred during the Great War, and indeed the very difficult adjustments to peace afterwards. There were already serious economic danger signs, and the massive emigration phenomenon that was to see something like 500,000 Scots emigrate from Scotland in the 1920s. This was well underway. A sense of anxiety about the nation's future gripped the elites of the time, and much of this fed into a panic about the effects of Irish immigration in particular. The form that this panic took was the scapegoating of the Irish Catholic community as alien to Scotland's national character. In 1923, as is well known, a report about the so-called menace posed by Irish Catholics was presented to the Church of Scotland General Assembly. Another matter we should consider was the impact of IRA activity in Scotland during the Irish War of Independence and the subsequent Civil War. This had been considerable. There had been incidents in, for example, nearby Bothwell, where a policeman had been killed. There had also been incidents in Glasgow. And this undoubtedly helped to fuel intolerance. Oral testimonies of emigrants from Scotland to places like Australia and New Zealand in this period referred to the Irish Troubles as having split Scotland down the middle. Militant Protestantism also fed off the controversy of the Education Act of 1918. Now, this act had brought Catholic schools in Scotland into the state system with full financial support, while leaving the Catholic Church in full control of the schools. Now, this was at a time when the Protestant churches were relinquishing their educational responsibilities and handing them over to the state. So there was a lot going on, and it's clear that in constituencies like Motherwell, many electors were being swayed back and forth by respective appeals to class and to religious loyalties and identities. Ferguson won the seat in 1923. Maybe we could go back to the 23, James, sorry. Probably by virtue of moderate unionists and liberals deciding that he was the lesser evil to the communist. And also, maybe by a supreme irony, Ferguson might have been helped by the Catholic Church actually trying to dissuade many of its followers from voting communist. So the Unionist Party also at this time, and they were called the Unionist Party in Scotland just as they were in Northern Ireland, the Unionists were this time facing difficulties over the Irish question, very severe difficulties. And this was an account of its support for the Irish Treaty of December 1921, which the Orange Order certainly regarded as a betrayal that put Ulster's position in peril. A separate party, the Orange and Protestant Party, the OPP, was actually set up in 1922. And although Ferguson may not actually have been a member, it was largely this dissident strain of popular unionism that he represented and that he drew support from. And it should also be remembered that Orange-Tory relations in Scotland had always been deeply uneasy. Ferguson's time at Westminster was notable for some inflammatory interventions. For example, he made much of the alleged resentment in Scotland over the 1918 Education Act. Quote, "There was a stranglehold on the Scottish people by the Church of Rome in the manner of taxation and the cost of schools," he said in October 1924. He also regularly weighed in support of Ulster, the backbone of this nation, presumably the British nation. And he warned that if Ulster was coerced into the Free State, quote, 80% of the people of Scotland would be up in arms against it. If it did not cause friction in England, it was going to cause bad blood in Scotland. The English, he scoffed, were too soft. Ferguson was to the fore in the opposition to the Labour government's Irish Free State Confirmation of Agreement Bill, that appointed a boundary commissioner for Northern Ireland against its will. And we should keep in mind the unsettling effects of the Irish boundary question, the boundary commission issue, not only in Ireland and Northern Ireland, but also in parts of Scotland, at least until it was settled in 1925. So let's then come to the 1924 contest, which was a straight fight between Ferguson and the Reverend James Barr. Barr's candidature was confirmed after talks between the ILP, to which Barr belonged, and the local communists. The latter were clearly calculating that Barr would command a wider appeal than any candidate that they might put forward. And it appears that they were seriously considering putting forward the well-known Red Clydesider figure of Willie Gallagher. But why was it thought that Barr would have such a wide appeal? Firstly, it was not usual for a churchman to enter politics, but Barr was an unusual churchman. He was not only a minister, I think he was a veritable tribune of the people. He had combined his ministry in the United Free Church with what we would now call social work in the deprived area of Govan in Glasgow. And he had also combined it with political activism. He had made the journey, which was common in Scotland at the time, from liberalism to socialism, or to the brand of ethical socialism represented by the ILP that James has discussed, with all its support for causes such as temperance. Barr was also a pacifist. He had been a pacifist throughout the First World War, despite the fact that his son actually served in the war. In his election address in 1924, Barr was described as, quote, closely connected with all that is best in Scottish life, with Scottish religion, with Scottish education, with Scottish temperance, and with Scottish political idealism. He has behind him a lifetime of service to noble causes, and before him a wider prospect of ever-expanding usefulness, unquote. Barr was also, it should be said, a strong supporter of Scottish Home Rule, as Keir Hardie indeed had been. And indeed, Barr was to introduce into the House of Commons in 1928 a bill that, had it been passed, would have made Scotland a dominion, like the Irish Free State. However, it's Barr's religious convictions that I'd like to dwell on. He was a devout opponent of the establishment principle in religious affairs. That is to say that he believed that no church should receive favours from the state, since it would compromise its mission. He upheld what was called the principle of voluntarism, and he was to be a leading figure in the opposition to the Presbyterian church reunion in Scotland in 1929, when the established Church of Scotland merged with the United Free Church, of which Barr had been a minister. The United Free Church itself had been the product of a merger in 1900, and here we enter the Byzantine world of Scottish Presbyterianism, and we could say more in the discussion. Barr may have been regarded by some as a kind of cranky religious refusenik, but actually, in the context of the time, he was viewed by many more as a man of principle and integrity. He was, in a sense, the conscience of the Presbyterian tradition. I am a Protestant of the Protestants, he once proclaimed. And he saw himself in a line of descent from his covenanting forefathers of the 17th century. Indeed, he was to write towards the end of his life a popular and frankly hagiographical history of the Covenanters. And throughout his time in public life, he took every opportunity to honour their memory, their courage, their convictions, and their sacrifices. The blood of the Covenanters is in my veins. In Barr's view, the Covenanters were the pioneers of full civil and religious freedom, and they stood for the rule of the people against the domination of arbitrary princes. Barr also revered the Covenanters on account of what he saw as their Scottish religious patriotism. They were asserting, quote, our Scottish nationalism in the sphere of religion, and seeking to maintain our ancient Scottish independence, unquote. It's noteworthy, indeed, that Barr should have equated in this way Scotland's Presbyterian character with a certain concept of independence. The historian Colin Kidd has demonstrated how the main fault line between Scotland and England within the Union concerned religious matters. Had Scotland not been convinced that she exercised religious freedom, the Union quite probably would not have survived. Religious matters, in an important sense, eclipsed political ones until the 20th century. And even at this point, in the early 1920s, we can detect reverberations of the tensions that had produced the Great Disruption in Scotland of 1843 and had led to the different perceptions and interpretations of the Union in Scotland and in England. Colin Kidd has even posed the question of whether the 1921 Act that ostensibly guaranteed the established Church of Scotland's spiritual freedom, although not in the opinion of James Barr, amounted to a breach of the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. We might say that the notion of Westminster parliamentary sovereignty had never been widely subscribed to in Scotland. But to return finally to Motherwell in 1924, Barr triumphed at a very difficult election for Labour and for the left. Overall, Labour lost 8 seats in this election in Scotland, and they trailed the Unionists by 10 seats. Barr triumphed over the politics of sectarian scaremongering. His social gospel and his brand of popular Protestantism, drawing on the mythology of the Covenanters, trumped the orange brand of his opponent, Hugh Ferguson. Barr's identification with a certain kind of thrawn Protestant principle was put to effective use for a socialist or left-wing political purpose, and indeed was put to use for the purpose of holding in check the anti-Catholic message espoused by his opponent. Barr stressed during the campaign that he stood for complete religious equality, and indeed when he was returned to Westminster, he, like the other Scottish Labour MPs who were mainly Presbyterian, voted in favour of the Catholic Relief Act of 1926. Hugh Ferguson's frustrations over Barr's political impact are vividly revealed in a letter that he, Ferguson, wrote to a Unionist MP, Sir Alexander Sprott, in 1927. In this letter, Ferguson refers to Barr as, quote, "the sharpest weapon the devil has employed since the Reformation to the ruined body and soul of the whole community. His powers as a minister, enabling him to twist the scriptures for political purposes and accepted without question by most people, is not realised," unquote. He later referred to Barr as Rome's henchman, a jibe which truly underscored the peculiarities and the ironies within the world of religion and politics in Scotland at this time. So, some conclusions, and I want to maybe just take a bit further some of the points that James was making there. First, religion was deeply mixed in with politics and national identity in Scotland as well as in Ulster/Northern Ireland. Ferguson and Barr appealed to what they both saw as most voters' strong sense of religious identity. Barr's victory showed that there was much mileage in popular Protestantism for the left and for radical and socialist politics in Scotland, in some contrast to Northern Ireland, where the radical Presbyterian history that was available presented obvious difficulties in terms of its use, notwithstanding the efforts that Marshall made. Secondly, class and its interaction with religion and national identity was a feature of both places. It's been rather glibly assumed that there was a kind of forward march of Labour in Scotland from the Red Clydeside dramas of World War I through the electoral victories of 1922 and 23, which were achieved in the back of the new franchise, and that there was an inevitability about the prevalence of class politics. Well, it was not as straightforward as that. This forward march faltered to some extent in the 1920s, against the background of pressures of popular patriotism and sectarianism, economic uncertainty, emigration, Red Scares, and Irish Catholic scapegoating. Barr's victory at Motherwell was a hugely symbolic boost and was the kind of thing that made a real difference to the capacity of class solidarity ultimately to contain sectarianism. In Northern Ireland, I think we also need to caution against notions of inevitability. This time, the assumption that class politics never stood a chance. The early years of Northern Ireland were full of uncertainty, as James has explained. The West Belfast result of 1923 suggests at the very least that there was potential for Labour politics to grow. By 1924, a lot of the scares and the stampedes and so on that James has mentioned had made an impact. The boundary question was coming to the boil. Sectarian appeals duly prevailed, but we should not accept the notion so readily that Northern Ireland politics were immediately set in a sectarian zero-sum mould. It's also important, I think, to keep in mind that class was a significant variable in Northern Ireland politics even after the state had become securely established. Why else would the Unionists have reproduced socio-economic legislation from Westminster of a left-of-centre kind? Finally, we would point to the way that Christian socialism manifested itself in both places and drew on the ILP's crusading moral zeal. Midgley, as well as Barr, couched his rhetoric in religious/evangelical idiom. The degree to which Christian socialism is a significant part of Scotland's political history now tends to be overlooked, and this, I think, needs to be remedied. As for Northern Ireland, even if it amounted to a minor strand in the overall political tapestry, we ought to acknowledge the efforts and the sacrifices of those who stood for it in tense and difficult times. Moreover, it did not disappear. Other notable figures such as Albert McElroy, Sadie Patterson and David Blakely of the NILP, they would later play their parts in more recent, if equally, troubled times. Thanks.